everybody, I hope you're all well, not too bogged down with assignments and dissertations and sign off. This session is aimed at students that are near to registering. I hope it really helps you prepare for a Band 5 nursing interview. So you might have one secured or you might have one coming up in the future. Do check out my other videos. They're all free on my YouTube channel, linked to career support and development, and I'll upload on Sundays. So I hope the session helps you. So I'm going to provide an overview of some key background research that will help your preparation for interview, talk through what to expect during your interview and how to prepare for that interview day, how to plan for some generic Band 5 interview questions, how to deal with nerves, we all have them, experienced nurses get just as nervous before interviews, and how to learn from interview feedback, which is really important. So when you're looking at structuring your background research prior to interview, the first thing you need to do is establish what type of interview have you been invited for. Is it a face-to-face interview, a virtual interview, value-based interview? Will you have some practical paper exercises to do with case studies? Do you need to prepare a presentation? If you don't know, check on the invite letter or email, or ask the human resources recruitment lead, email back whoever sent you the letter and find out if you're not quite sure. It's very unlikely you'll be asked to prepare a presentation. If you are, see my video preparing a presentation for interview that's coming out. I am aware though that there will be some people out there that are applying for research posts, for posts that would be for any healthcare professional, which includes newly registered and early career nurses. They might be 6 months registered, a year. If you meet that shortlisting criteria, you essentially can be shortlisted. So there may be some of you out there that do need to prepare for a presentation. If not, when you eventually start going across pathways and up a career to different bands and different senior level roles, then you might remember to go back to the video. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. Second thing, what does the role, the specialist field, actually entail? So gain some insights into what you're applying for. And if you're a student nurse, you may have already, which you probably are, you may already have had a placement which has led you to apply specifically for that area. That's fantastic. You'll have gained lots of insights on placement. There's always a percentage of students that will apply for an area that they've never worked in before, and I say that is the time to do it now. The next 2 or 3 years when you're registered, go and try different areas and find an area of interest to you and try different specialisms and fields. However, I wouldn't leave the first role purely to chance, and which is why I have a video on how to choose your first role. And in that video, a key thing I suggest that you do is an informal visit, so that you can compare areas and check that they will provide a level of support and education that you deserve when you are registered. So an informal visit is really helpful. Review job description and personal specification, because that will have some key headings that will help you prepare for interview. And on a job description, you might have a key heading that says team working, compassionate, person-centered care. Right, just bullet point these key terms, because you may be asked a question at interview. You might not, but it's fantastic to have done a bit of background reading anyway. You probably know them already, but in an interview you can become quite nervous, and which is usual, and you might forget. So if you've just reminded yourself and revisited some of those key terms and what they mean to you, it's helpful background reading for your interview. I'm aware that some of you won't apply for a specific role, you'll be applying for an employer. Some employers do transition interviews at 2nd and 3rd year or 4th year if you're a dual registered nurse. And that on the application, sometimes they will ask for preferences of areas or fields. So you could gear your personal statement and look at those specific areas and gain a little bit of information about those specialist areas before interview. Or you might also want to look at what's this employer about. And it won't just be, you might not be applying for a hospital trust or a community trust. They will have big websites that you can look on. It could be a nursing home, but they still will have employer websites and lots of great information on there for you to read before interview. It could be a prison. It could be for a small private employer or a charity. It could be in a GP practice. There's such a massive range of roles out there. So whatever employer it is, go and look them up and have a look at what their employer values, and they should link to the NHS values, which leads nicely on to reflect on values. So what are your core values? How do they align with the employer and the NHS values? Because sometimes questions are linked to those values. It's also important to do background research on key healthcare terms and definitions, and you might see some of these key terms come out when you look at the job description, personal specification, you look on the employer website. Depending on your fields of nursing, some key terms might be quality improvement, standards, clinical governance, evidence-based practice, risk assessments, audit, leadership, health education and promotion. And you've probably covered a lot of these terms during your degree. But what many students, when they're given a key term at interview, I've seen quite a few go blank. So something like evidence-based practice, which is just applying best evidence that's best available evidence to inform your practice, they just go completely blank, even though they could probably explain it. So just revising those key terms and putting a few bullet points just to prompt you, or mnemonics maybe if you need them. And also local and national systems and standards of care are really good just to revise. And your local policies will be informed by national laws and policies and guidance. Good ones to look at are policies to do with escalation, medications, instant reporting, discharge planning, and there's others that you might think really link to your field of nursing. I'm adult nursing, but there may be others there. Complaints might be another one, complaints policy. And that's because you will be asked questions, usually a scenario-based question somewhere at interview, not always, but usually there'll be some form of scenario-based question, as in what would you do if CDs went missing, for example. So knowing some of these policies and revising them is helpful. Risk assessments is also really good to look up. You've got falls assessments, mental capacity assessment, deprivation of liberty safeguards, and quality standards linked to all the fields of nursing. So it's just good to revise them. And then obviously the NMC code as well, looking at accountability, confidentiality. And as I said, usually scenario-based questions, you'd be using a person-centered approach, you'd be looking at your communication and skills, but then also it may link to a policy linked to escalation. So you're looking at the theory and evidence base underpinning your answers as well. So you've looked at your key healthcare terms, you've looked at the policies and guidelines nationally, locally, and it's not just about the policies and guidelines though. You've also got to think of your patient, and it's about your communication with your patient. So if you were asked, what would you do? You've got to use a kind, caring, compassionate approach, and it's really helpful to review past case examples. And you also, if you have a value-based interview, you might be asked to give an example that's anonymised, and you adhere to confidentiality, so you don't mention the ward and the patient couldn't be identifiable. And when you're bringing examples, practical application and examples, you need to review past placement feedback and course assignments to identify and think about those practice examples, and that will be really helpful for your interview. So if you try and find an example from your past that you can remember where you demonstrated a compassionate approach, collaborative team working, or delivering quality care or education, an example that demonstrates learning from feedback or overcoming a challenge, and that will really help just in case you're asked a question in relation to one of those areas. And finally, roles and responsibilities. So sometimes you will have a question linked to accountability or delegation, and it's helpful to understand support worker roles to registered nurse. So we have health and social care support workers, or it might be a nursing assistant or clinical support worker. And then we have nursing associates in England and assistant practitioners, and the differences between those roles. So that if you do have a scenario-based question about accountability, you may think about delegating to other support worker roles. And I've got a video on differences between support worker to registered nurse, so nursing associate, assistant practitioner, and so that might be quite helpful just to revise that, because they have different levels of education and have different competencies and standards and proficiencies. So I've just summarised those in some really short videos. And then finally, some current hot topics. So currently, obviously, it's COVID, staff wellbeing, or any other media issues in nursing journals and in the current media, like the news, for example. It's just helpful to keep up to date. Preparing for your interview. So as we mentioned earlier, there's different types of interviews. So it could be a face-to-face or online or virtual interview. Is it a few hours or 20, 30 minutes long? Always double check the date and time. I do know students that accidentally put the wrong date in their diary, and it's easy done. So just do double check that you've got the date right. Are there scenario-based exercises, group discussions or presentations, which is unlikely, but there may be. Some pre-checks to do. So if it is a face-to-face interview, always check the location, travel links. If it's a virtual interview, check your internet connections and make sure that you can see your face and that the camera's still. So ideally, you should not be holding a phone in your hand. Try and have some books there if you have to use your phone, and try and hold it in position. If you've got a clamp or something, that's fantastic. But if you have to, just try and position it so you're not holding it in your hand, so you're not worrying about it, because inevitably it will move or your hand will be very, very tired by the end of the interview. And try and make sure that there's no disturbances or other interruptions. If you are really worried about where to do the interview, so you might live in a multiple occupancy house, you might have loads of 5 children in the house, it may be helpful to talk to your personal tutor or somebody on placement, a university lecturer, and try and book a room. So I know that I've done that for a student actually, where I've booked a room for them, and because they just felt they couldn't do it at home and they were having problems at home anyway. So that was really helpful for them. Now you've also got healthcare libraries. So often libraries and local libraries as well, you can book a quiet room. And if you talk to senior nurses on placement and give them enough notice, they would often help you as well. And clinical educators will try and book rooms as well. So try and look at alternatives. The other thing would be just try and make it as calm as possible. Now, with children, I think you cannot be looking after young children and doing an interview. And if you were doing a face-to-face interview, it would not be acceptable to bring children to an interview. So with virtual interviews, don't do it. Just, you need to get your childcare sorted if they're young children. And it's also because you need to be able to concentrate and be quiet, concentrate on those questions as well. if you're worried about background, so like I've done Microsoft Team meetings and Zoom meetings where my house is a complete tip. So I'll go where there's a blank wall. So you have no idea what's behind these doors, but it's messy. And but you can also put backgrounds on using Teams or Microsoft Teams. Now, I do know if your internet connection's poor, sometimes you can't do that, and the videoing can be quite poor. So that's where I would book a room in the library if you can, or in a placement area, or in the university somewhere. And because of COVID, there's a lot more virtual working from home, but the universities are still open, so you've actually got more opportunities to get that quiet room if you did really need it. Most people want to do it at home and can just get a quiet room though. Promote calmness, so try and get your clothes ready the night before, and so they're clean. Don't go out night clubbing. I mean, I know students that have done that and managed to secure roles, but I would not recommend. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not your mum, but you want to be in the best frame of mind possible and awake. If you need to cancel, email and phone as soon as possible. And employers are not obliged to offer another interview, but most would rearrange another date and time for you if you inform them as soon as you can. And obviously we're aware there's emergencies, and you're going for a role where there's lots of vacancies and employers really need newly registered nurses. As you move along career pathways and you apply for more senior positions, you'll have a lot more competition for roles, and you may find that they won't reschedule. But if there's been an emergency, usually they will, as long as you've informed them before the interview. Obviously, if it was a dire emergency and you were really poorly, you wouldn't be expected to, but most employers would rearrange. So value-based interviews are used by some employers, and they aim to select individuals who align most closely with the values of the organisation and NHS. So that's why I got you to do a bit of prep on that earlier on the earlier slides. And what you might find is you have a technical interview and a value-based interview where you're asked one or two value-based interview questions. They will start with a generic question in a value-based interview. So an example might be, give me an example where you provided compassionate care in your placement. And then that will be followed by further probing and questions that are more specific and drilling down according to what you say initially. So it's really good that you've got your examples prepared beforehand. If you're asked a value-based interview question, it's helpful to note that the interviewers expect a relevant example that demonstrates your understanding and your practical application. And a mistake that people make of all levels of staff is they talk generically about the topic area. So they might say, well, during my degree programme, I always provide compassionate care. Or they'll talk about something they observed where other people provided the compassionate care. So it's important to choose examples where you can demonstrate your practical application, because without the specific detail from a relevant example, your answers will be rated low on a value-based interview. So all the preparation I said earlier about picking an example linked to practice, it's important to prepare those examples, and a good tip would be to prepare one for compassionate care, one for team working, one for dealing with challenges, one for delivering quality care, and one on evidence-based practice. If you were looking at a role that was linked to education or health promotion, then you would align it to one of those themes. And another key tip is to not lie and pluck one out of the air that is not real, because when the interviewer starts to drill down, you won't be able to draw on your experiences. What to expect during your interview. So one lead interviewer usually starts off with introducing, chairs and manages the time. And there should always be more than one interviewer to prevent bias. And interviewers will make lots of notes when you answer questions, and that's normal. So don't let their writing or typing put you off at all. If you are asked to do a group exercise or discussion, you'll be observed and notes will be written about what you say if it's a group discussion, for example. And a health related topic may be set for you to discuss or for the group to discuss, and there may be a task to complete. There's less of those really with virtual interviews, but I have seen some discussion type interviews. Some students have told me that they had a group discussion on a topic. Try to contribute to the discussion, be it virtual, face-to-face, where you're socially distanced. Make sure you're non-judgmental and respectful of others. And at the end of the interview, whatever type of interview, you are usually invited to ask a question at the end. And so it's nice to have one question maybe prepared. It might be, when can you start? It might be a question about whether you can have a bit of time off over the summer. It could be any sort of question. It could be a question about education, preceptorship, whatever question you want to ask, do ask. What do the interviewers want to know? The key thing they want to know is you're the right person for the role. You hold the right values and you're choosing the role for the right reasons, which is why your preparation is really important, to go for roles that align to your values and your interests. Do you understand what you've applied for? Well, I've already told you on your preparation to have done that research about the specialist area, the role, the service or the employer. Are you compassionate, non-judgmental, a good communicator? And that's a must in any role. So a good listener and being patient is essential. So sometimes the scenario-based questions are really about communication with your patient and being a good listener. So if a patient was complaining or wanted to put a complaint in, or relative, it's about being calm, professional, being a good listener, using your communication skills, adhering to policies, yes, and escalating, but that communication and being non-judgmental is really important. Are you able to work well in a team? Collaborative and team working is a must. So what sort of team worker are you? You might want to look at Belbin's work, where you're looking at types of team working and what sort of team worker you are. How will you manage the workload and achieve a healthy work-life balance? Access support and help when needed, so that if you're worried about, so you might be asked a question, what are you most worried about when you start in your role? And the key thing is that you will ask if you don't know, and we don't expect you to know it all. But you know, it's important that you have a healthy work-life balance. Are you a safe, knowledgeable practitioner who will provide quality care? So use an evidence base, and that often links to scenario-based questions. Again, I've given you the preparation structure for those sort of questions. And then I've just got a few example generic questions. And why have you applied for this role? And you, as a policeman, as a teacher, as a doctor, you're going to be asked that question in some form. It might be worded slightly different. What led you to apply for a role in this specialist area? Tell me about what you know about this ward, this community setting. Research in the area. It depends what type of role you're applying for. So all the preparation I've given you will help inform that question, that answer. Tell me a bit about your nursing degree. What did you enjoy? What did you find challenging? And the key skills that are important for when working as in the role. So what key skills are important? Again, that links to the job description that you've looked at. You'll have done all your preparation for that. Why should we choose you for this role? Why should we offer you this opportunity? And don't be shy, be confident that you're inspired by the job description, your informal visit, you were a student in the area, whatever reasons, you're motivated to develop skills in this area, you're hardworking, whatever you think fits with you as a person. I'm not going to say what you should say because this is totally individualized to you. What are your strengths? If offered this role, what would you find challenging? What would you need the most support with? Give me an example from practice when you've delivered compassionate care, quality care. How do you evaluate the quality of your care, which I talked about earlier? Tell me about a time when you worked well in a team. So having that scenario and practice example is important. Tell me about a time when you learned from a challenging situation. How do you manage your work-life balance? So you can see there's key themes that come out. And if you look on the Royal College of Nursing websites under nursing careers and interviews, you'll see a lot more example questions. I've got a lot of example questions in my book, How to Prepare for Interviews. If you're interested, you can get it from a library if you don't want to buy it. And I've also got questions, example questions linked to key themes for band 5 and above, so right up to 6, band 6 or 7 for senior nursing positions. So an example for if you were looking at team working for this newly registered work, it might be tell me about a time when you worked well in a team. For an experienced nursing position, it might be how would you promote positive team working across a team or service, because you've got more of a leadership role. How would you deal with 2 members of staff refusing to work with each other? Again, a leadership, looking at people management and team working. It's a different type of question because it aligns to that job role where you've got leadership skills and you're looking at more of a global view of a service. So there's some good practical tips to answer some of those questions, as I said, or if you're going up later in your career there. And also, what are your nursing priorities? So thinking about example scenario questions, which I've talked about, talk through who's accountable. So as I said earlier, the preparation would help. How would you delegate to a support worker? How would you plan to communicate with someone who had a hearing difficulty? And your background research linked to the area you're applying for, you can think of some potential scenario questions to preempt possible questions. And looking at escalation policies and risk assessment, as I said, will really help you there. So some example scenario questions. You find that the controlled drugs are missing when you were doing CD checks. What do you do? So when you're looking at the policies, it will give you some clear guidance, but the first thing to do would be to check that it's not been a human error and going back and you double check in the CD book, for example. But there is strict guidance of what you do and an escalation policy. 99% of the time, somebody's made a mistake previously and put the wrong number in. But if they do go missing, it's very serious and potentially you can go right up to escalating to police if you think that there's been somebody stolen or a staff member might have stolen medication. So looking at the policy will help you. A patient has fallen and hit their head, and so you're looking at a falls. They should have had a falls risk assessment for a start. You come on a shift and you find that they've fallen, and in many scenarios, if you're not quite sure, you can use nursing process, assessment, planning, implementing, evaluation, A, B, C, D, E. So you can use a systematic approach according to the scenario. So if a patient's fallen and hit their head, the first thing is to assess them and assess using A, B, C, D, E really to make sure they've not got a subdural hematoma, they're able to talk, they're not confused. So you might want to start looking at that systematic approach. You shouldn't move them if they might have hit their head, but they might have hit their back or their neck. You might not be able to move them till a doctor comes. They might have had potential broken back, for example. And that's why an A, B, C, D, E or nursing process approach would help. Once you've looked at assessment and safety of the environment, then you might look to be moving them, and you would look at escalating to a doctor, doing observations obviously, and using a systematic approach there. I won't fill in the answer because you need to think about that. During a home visit, a patient or a client or person, if you prefer the terms, refuses wound care, and they state that they have not had a wash for 2 weeks and have no motivation to get out of bed. So you're doing a full patient-centered assessment here. It could be for many different types of reasons, and using a holistic approach will really help. They might have recently been bereaved, they might have lost a loved one or a pet, and they're very down. They might need a mental health assessment. There could be all different sorts of reasons here, and you're looking at a systematic approach and looking at really good communication skills, being kind, compassionate, trying to listen to them as to why they're refusing the wound care. And then you can bring in your patient education, and later, once you've done a little bit of that assessment first of all, but have a think about how you would answer a question such as that. And then obviously mental capacity might come in here as well, mental capacity assessment. Dealing with nerves. So finally, we're near the end, but it's really normal to be nervous before or during an interview, and interviewers expect this, and it's the same for all of us, when you experience whatever level of nursing role that you're going for. Just try and put it in context. There are lots of roles out there, and that employer wants newly registered nurses. So hopefully the chances are that if you've prepared for interview, you've got a higher chance of having been offered that role than if it was one educator role that comes up in 6 months. Also, if you're not offered the role, you can go for other roles. Again, there's other roles out there, and potentially you can go back to that same role if you've got your heart set on it in 6 months' time or a year's time when you've got a bit more experience. So do let the interviewers know if you're excessively nervous though, and they can support you. They might get you a glass of water or tell you to take some time out. And remember that you've done really well securing the interview. The interviewers are human and they want you to do well. So do ask for more time if you're excessively nervous. The more you prepare, the more confident you will feel. So doing some of those exercises before that I've given you and structuring your preparation will really help you. And using mnemonics or memory aids may help in case you go blank. Everyone's got all different ways of trying to think about how they're going to answer questions, and sometimes just having I use mnemonics a lot, helps. But if you go completely blank, just use the nursing process: assess, plan, implement and evaluate. A, B, C, D, E as well is really helpful. And just do your best. Put the interview in context, and as I said, you can apply again or apply for another role or apply again to that employer or to that line manager. What if I'm not offered the role? Don't be disheartened if you're not offered. Just make sure that you request verbal feedback from an employer. And employers are not obliged to offer written feedback, but they are with verbal feedback. And you can ask the interviewer some specific feedback. So you can say, thank you for my feedback. It's really helpful to inform me for future interviews. How could I improve my answers? You might say, what was my strongest or weakest answer? Because sometimes with feedback, they might be quite generic and quite quick. So you can specifically ask some questions and say, ask them what was your strongest, weakest answer, and hopefully they'll give you some helpful advice. And write it down so you don't forget for your next interview, because it's so easy to be upset after an interview, to just think, oh, I can't be bothered with it, and not follow up. If you follow up, it will inform you to help you for your future interviews, and don't give up. Some interviews I've gone for, when I went for a team leader role, I went for 3 interviews before I was offered my first team leader role. And the 3rd interview, I didn't do as much preparation because I started to get quite disheartened. I shouldn't say that, but I didn't. And the interviewer, I thought, didn't seem that interested. She was quite sort of, no facial expressions in interview, and I was rung and I didn't pick the phone up because I thought, oh, I don't think I've got the role. And I did. On the Monday morning she phoned back and she said I did really well. So you'll be surprised actually how much getting the feedback really does help with your development and will help your future interview skills. Reflect on that interview feedback. Also, writing the interview questions down afterwards, just in case, is really helpful so you don't forget them. And if you do find that you weren't successful, you can book a mock interview. So I do mock interviews. I offer mock interviews only with my people in my trust. Obviously, I don't want to be inundated. But if I'm not doing the interview, I'm not on the panel. If you're not on the panel, you can potentially ask any experienced nurse to do a mock interview with you, or a university lecturer may offer that as well. So try and find somebody that can career coach you that can do that. And so, in summary, key tips to success: allow some time to prepare for your interview. Never presume the job is yours. You'll hear some students say, oh, I didn't prepare at all and I was up till 2 in the morning and I got the job and it was really easy. Yes, it might be. There might be lots of roles with that employer, and they might be really bright and really good at interview, but I would prepare, if it was me, for my first post, just to, especially if it's an area that you really are interested in. Don't presume the job's yours. Preparation is the key, and as I said, learn from interview feedback if you're not, but it's very unlikely you won't be offered if you do your preparation. If you have got any questions, put them in the YouTube's question box. If you want to contact me on my website or DM me on Twitter or Instagram, very happy to answer questions, and good luck. Let me know how you get on at interview, and for the rest of your career, I wish you every success.